He was a king whose corpse exploded at his own funeral, and the smell was so unbearable that mourners fled the church before the ceremony could finish. William the Conqueror ruled England for 21 years with brutal efficiency and military brilliance, but what people remembered most about his death was not his conquests or his legacy. It was the moment his body burst open in front of everyone, releasing a stench so overwhelming that the burial had to be abandoned. This was not the result of assassination or battle wounds. It was the consequence of decades spent eating without restraint, ignoring every warning his failing digestive system sent him, until his body finally rebelled in the most grotesque way imaginable. William was born around 1028 as a bastard, the illegitimate son of a Norman duke and a tanner's daughter. His father died when he was 7 years old, leaving him to inherit Normandy while being known simply as William the Bastard throughout his childhood. That name carried all the contempt medieval society could heap on someone born outside marriage, and it marked him in ways that shaped everything about who he would become. He survived assassination attempts and civil war during those early years by learning to be more brutal than anyone who threatened him, and by the time he reached adulthood he had developed a reputation for savage effectiveness that made nobles think twice before challenging his authority. His claim to England came through a distant cousin who ruled there and allegedly promised him the throne. When that promise was broken and someone else took the crown in 1066, William assembled an invasion force and crossed the Channel with an army. The Battle of Hastings lasted less than a day but changed everything. He was crowned King of England that Christmas and spent the next 2 decades imposing his rule through military force and systematic oppression of anyone who resisted. But ruling required constant movement between England and Normandy, endless travel and military campaigns, and William threw himself into it with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life, including eating. The feasts at his court became legendary even by medieval standards where excess was already expected. Tables would groan under roasted meats and game birds, pies stuffed with organ meats, bread soaked in animal fat, and wine that flowed without restraint. William ate portions that would have satisfied 3 normal men, and he did this not at special celebrations but at every single meal as standard practice. His appetite seemed boundless, driven by something that went beyond hunger into genuine compulsion. He would finish his own plate and then eat from platters meant for others, and nobody dared suggest he should stop because suggesting such a thing to William was dangerous. The consequences began showing themselves earlier than they might have in a man with less punishing habits. After particularly large meals he would experience severe bloating, his stomach distending visibly beneath his clothing until he looked pregnant with the sheer volume of undigested food. The pressure made breathing difficult and forced him to retreat to his chambers and lie down until his body could process at least some of what he had consumed. But worse than the bloating were the gases that came with it, building up in his intestines with such force that releasing them provided only brief relief before the pressure started accumulating again. His servants grew accustomed to the sounds and smells that came from their monarch, though they learned quickly never to acknowledge what they heard or noticed if they valued their positions. The flatulence was constant and extraordinarily potent, clearing rooms when it happened and causing visible discomfort to anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. But William treated this as merely an inconvenience rather than a warning. He would joke about it sometimes, making crude comments about the power of his royal wind, but he never once considered that eating less might solve the problem. As William aged and his body lost the resilience of youth, these digestive troubles intensified from uncomfortable to genuinely debilitating. Meals that would have caused him a few hours of bloating in his 30s now left him incapacitated for entire days in his 40s and 50s, unable to attend meetings or make decisions because his gut was in such agony. His intestines seemed to process food more slowly with each passing year, and there were times when he would eat a large dinner and still feel the weight of it sitting undigested in his stomach 2 days later, fermenting and producing gases that caused cramping severe enough to make him double over. The gas production during these episodes was truly extraordinary, filling his chambers with a miasma so thick that even hardened soldiers who had spent years on campaign would flee outside gasping for fresh air. And alongside the gas came diarrhea, sudden and explosive episodes that gave him almost no warning. He would be in the middle of a meeting when the cramping would suddenly intensify and he would know he had perhaps minutes to reach a latrine before disaster became inevitable. His servants learned to read the signs in his face, a particular tightness and grimace that meant they needed to clear a path immediately, and even then there were occasions when he did not make it in time. But rather than modifying his eating to accommodate a digestive system that was clearly failing, William seemed to interpret his body's rebellion as a challenge that needed to be overcome through force of will. He continued eating massive portions at every meal, as if admitting he could no longer handle such quantities would be the same as admitting weakness. When the bloating became too severe, he would drink strong wine until he passed out. When his clothes no longer fit around his expanding waistline, he ordered new garments made in larger sizes rather than reducing his intake. His weight increased dramatically during his later years as his body began storing as fat what it could no longer properly digest. By the mid-1080s, William had grown so large that mounting a horse required assistance, and walking any distance left him short of breath and sweating even in cool weather. His face had become jowly and his neck had thickened until it disappeared into his shoulders, and his stomach hung over his belt in folds that his clothing could no longer conceal. The transformation from powerful warrior to bloated monarch was stark enough that it attracted comment even in an age when few people dared criticize a king. In the summer of 1087, the French king mocked him openly, suggesting that William looked like he was lying in childbed waiting to give birth. The insult struck directly at his pride in ways that political challenges never could, touching the deep insecurity he felt about his physical decline. William roused himself and launched an attack on a French town in what can only be understood as wounded pride rather than strategy. The campaign succeeded in burning the town, but it proved catastrophic for William personally because of what happened while he was riding through the smoldering streets. His horse reared suddenly and threw him forward hard against the pommel of his saddle, and his enormous weight came down with crushing force directly onto his massively distended stomach. The impact ruptured his intestines internally, tearing the tissue and allowing the contents to leak into his abdominal cavity where they would cause infection that medieval medicine had no way to treat. William was carried to his residence near Rouen, and there he lay dying over 6 weeks while bacteria from his perforated gut spread through his body and poisoned his blood. The pain during those final weeks must have been beyond anything even a lifetime of medieval warfare had prepared him for. His ruptured intestines were leaking digestive acids directly into his abdominal cavity, causing inflammation that would have felt like burning from the inside. Fever consumed him as his body tried desperately to fight off the bacterial invasion, and delirium came in waves as the infection progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. The court physicians had no understanding of what was killing him because they had no concept of internal injuries they could not see. They tried bloodletting and heated poultices and herbal remedies that were utterly useless against what was happening inside him. As William lay dying through those long August weeks, his body continued the digestive rebellion that had plagued his later years, but now without any ability to expel what was building up. The bacteria multiplying in his ruptured intestines were producing enormous quantities of gas as they broke down tissue and consumed the leaked contents of his gut. His stomach swelled even larger than it had during his worst episodes while alive, distending grotesquely as gases accumulated with nowhere to escape. The pressure must have been agonizing, adding another layer of torment to the pain from infection and fever. On September 9, 1087, William finally died, and the moment his last breath left his body, something happened that revealed exactly how his nobles truly felt about him. The great lords who had kept vigil at his bedside immediately fled the room without a word, rushing back to their own territories to secure their positions now that the throne was vacant. The servants who remained showed no respect for their fallen monarch. Instead, they stripped him of everything valuable, looting his clothing and jewelry, taking tapestries and furniture, until his corpse lay naked on the floor. This was how much his power had rested on fear rather than loyalty. Eventually someone took pity and paid to have the body embalmed and transported to Caen for burial at a church William himself had founded decades earlier. But the embalming was done hastily and poorly, partly because the body had already begun decomposing in the late summer heat, and partly because the bacteria in his ruptured intestines were still actively multiplying and producing gas even though he was dead. The journey from Rouen to Caen covered roughly 70 miles, and every hour of that journey gave those bacteria more time to consume tissue and generate more gases that were filling the corpse beyond any natural dimension. When the funeral procession finally arrived in Caen after days of travel, a fire broke out in the town that forced everyone to abandon the burial preparations and fight the flames. More delays, more time for decomposition to progress, more bacterial activity producing more gas inside a body that was swelling to proportions that exceeded even his considerable bulk during life. Then, just as the fire was extinguished, a man appeared claiming the land where the church stood had been stolen from his father by William, and he demanded compensation before allowing the burial to proceed. More negotiations, more delays, more days passing while the corpse continued its grotesque transformation. By the time the funeral mass actually began, weeks had passed since his death, and what lay in the coffin bore little resemblance to the powerful warrior who had conquered England. The summer heat and internal decomposition had inflated his body to truly monstrous proportions, his stomach swollen so grotesquely that the skin was stretched tight like an overinflated bladder. The bacteria consuming his intestines had produced such enormous quantities of gas that his torso was essentially a pressurized container held together only by increasingly fragile tissue. The smell emanating from the coffin was already overwhelming before anyone attempted to move him, a stench of rot so powerful that even monks accustomed to preparing corpses found themselves struggling not to vomit during the ceremony. The funeral mass proceeded with whatever dignity could be maintained while clergy and mourners tried to focus on prayers while breathing through their mouths to avoid the worst of it. But the real horror came when it was time for actual burial, when the body had to be moved from the coffin into the stone tomb that had been carved into the church floor. The workers immediately realized they faced a serious problem. The tomb had been prepared years earlier and sized for a man of normal proportions, but the gas-bloated corpse was far too large to fit. His distended stomach alone was wider than the opening, and there was simply no way to lower him in without somehow compressing the body to fit the available space. The workers did what they always did when faced with an impossible task that could not be refused. They tried to force it anyway. They pushed and shoved at the swollen corpse, attempting to compress it enough to squeeze through the opening, applying increasing pressure as the body refused to cooperate. And then, with a sound that witnesses later described as genuinely explosive and audible throughout the church, his stomach ruptured catastrophically. The pressurized gases that had been accumulating for weeks suddenly found an escape route, and what followed was a release of decomposed material and gases that sprayed across the workers and filled the entire church with a miasma so unbearably vile that it transcended anything the assembled crowd had ever experienced. The smell was not merely strong or unpleasant in the way corpses normally smell. It was physically oppressive, a concentrated essence of rot that seemed to coat your throat and lungs when you breathed, that made your eyes water and your stomach heave involuntarily. People fled the church immediately, abandoning all pretense of ceremony or respect, some vomiting before they reached the doors, others making it outside only to collapse retching in the churchyard. The workers who had been directly involved were drenched in fluids, and no amount of washing would fully remove the smell from their skin and clothing for days. The monks attempted to salvage what remained by quickly completing the burial, pushing what was left into the tomb and sealing it as rapidly as possible, but the damage was done. The smell lingered in the church for weeks despite all efforts to ventilate and cleanse the space with incense and herbs. This was the end that William earned through a lifetime of refusing to acknowledge the limits of his own body. He had conquered England through military brilliance and brutality. He had imposed a new ruling system that would shape the country for centuries. He had transformed the political landscape of medieval Europe through force of will. But all of that was overshadowed in the moment his corpse exploded in front of everyone who had come to pay their respects. One of history's most powerful monarchs was reduced to a cautionary tale about gluttony and the ultimate powerlessness of kings against their own mortality. The man who had spent decades enforcing his will through violence and fear, who had made nobles tremble and populations submit, who believed that strength and ruthlessness could overcome any obstacle, discovered too late that some battles cannot be won through force. His digestive system had been sending warnings for years through pain and bloating and constant gas, telling him that his body could not continue processing the enormous quantities he forced into it. But William had interpreted those warnings as challenges to overcome rather than limits to respect. He ate through the pain and ignored the increasing severity of his symptoms because acknowledging them would mean admitting vulnerability, and he could never afford to appear vulnerable even to himself. The explosion at his funeral was the final rebellion of a body pushed beyond all reasonable limits for decades. What makes his story so darkly fascinating is not just the grotesque nature of his death and burial, but what it reveals about the fundamental disconnect between power and biology. William had spent his entire life conquering territories and subduing populations through military force and political cunning. He had built an empire through ruthless determination and an absolute refusal to accept defeat or limitation. But all of that power and all of that will meant absolutely nothing when applied to the basic functioning of his own digestive system. You cannot conquer your own intestines through force of personality, you cannot intimidate your stomach into processing more food than it can handle, and you cannot rule your body the way you rule a kingdom. The irony is that William probably could have avoided this fate entirely with even minimal self-control. If he had eaten normal portions instead of gorging himself at every meal, if he had paid attention to the warning signs his body was sending and modified his behavior accordingly, if he had been willing to admit that he had physical limitations that needed to be respected, he might have lived years longer and died peacefully in his bed. But that kind of self-restraint and acknowledgement of limitation was fundamentally incompatible with who William was as a person. The same qualities that made him an effective conqueror and ruler made it impossible for him to moderate his appetites or admit weakness even to himself. His grave was disturbed multiple times in the centuries following his death, looted during religious wars and destroyed during the French Revolution, until nothing remained of his actual remains. Today only a simple stone marker indicates where he was supposedly buried, and even that is more symbolic than accurate. In a sense, this seems fitting for a man whose body literally refused to stay quietly in the ground on the first attempt. William the Conqueror left England with castles and laws and a new ruling class that would dominate the country for generations, but he left his own funeral with an explosion that emptied a church and a smell that lingered for weeks. The lesson his death taught was not about military strategy or political power or the glory of conquest. It was about the fundamental reality that all human bodies have limits, that ignoring those limits has consequences, and that death is the great equalizer that reduces even conquerors to flesh that decomposes and produces gas like any other corpse. William spent his life trying to be larger than life, conquering more territory and eating more food and inspiring more fear than any man around him. In the end, he succeeded at being larger than life in the most literal and unfortunate way possible, so swollen with gases from decomposition that his corpse could not fit in its tomb and burst when forced, leaving behind not a legend of military glory but a story about what happens when you refuse to acknowledge that even kings are just human beings with digestive systems that can fail.